Wow, what a last game that was. And now in our next game here, Hans Niemann is playing as white. He opens 24, and here Magnus throws a big curveball. You don't want to miss this. He goes for the modern defense with the move G6, and I'm giving this move 2 exclamation points for style points. And if you don't like it, cry me a river in the comment section. I'm going with it. 2 exclamation points right here. Now Hans Niemann D4. Magnus goes D6. Already a little bit weird. Instead, Bishop G7 was the standard idea. Let's see what he has in mind. Here, D6 on the board. Hans Knight C3, very standard. And now C6. Okay, this is a little bit of a Magnus Carlsen specialty. He really likes doing this. My most popular video was Alireza Firouzja versus Magnus Carlsen. In that game, Alireza went F4. And then Magnus Carlsen absolutely loves this line as black, where you go D5. And if white goes E5, you go H5, with the idea of going H4 and maybe even Knight A6 to C7 to E6 to G7, which Magnus Carlsen did in that one game versus Alireza Firouzja. Now, in the game, Hans Niemann does not fall for this trap. It's not a trap, but it's a very tricky line Magnus likes to play. Instead, here he goes Knight to F3, staying in complete control. Magnus Knight to F6, transposing back to a Pyrrhic defense. Of course, the modern is where you don't go Knight to F6, and the Pyrrhic is where you do play that move. Now here Hans, A4, expanding on the queen side. I guess he was nervous about B5 ideas. Again, in this match so far, Hans playing super conservative as white, trying to stay in control as much as possible. Now Magnus, Bishop G7, Bishop E2, castles, and Knight D7. So far, very, very standard development. This is the most classical way to develop as white. Bishop E2 ensure castles, and black basically doing the same. He's ready to perhaps counterattack in the center with the move E5. From there, he will be a little bit worse, but overall, it's a relatively respectable position for Magnus Carlsen. Now here, Hans Niemann, Bishop E3 played in the game. I was a little bit surprised when I saw him play this move. I thought he would go H3 first. The idea being H3 stops Knight G4 ideas from black. If you go Bishop E3 first, as he did in the game, Knight G4 is possible, trying to win the bishop pair. Then Hans can go Bishop G5 or Bishop C1, and it's a little bit crazy, but Magnus didn't play this in the game. Instead, Queen C7. Okay, setting up E5 ideas still. Hans goes H3, stopping Knight G4. Very good. And then instead of E5, the most standard move you can make in this position as black, trying to fight for the center, here Magnus goes B6. So this is his big idea in this game. He's staying very passive on the 6th rank, all of his pawns on the 7th or 6th rank so far, and he's just kind of waiting for Hans Niemann to make a mistake, and he's trying to make the game very confusing and unusual for his opponent. So again, when you're Magnus Carlsen, literally the GOAT, and you're playing Hans Niemann, a guy you don't have much respect for, you like to play these weird openings sometimes. This is kind of how it goes. Now here Hans, Queen D2, standard idea, setting up Bishop H6 ideas in the future, trying to get rid of black's dark squared bishop on G7. At that point, his dark squares will be a lot weaker around the king side. Now Magnus, Bishop B7, the main idea of B6. So far, so good for Magnus. Now Hans, Rook D1, somewhat committal move. Instead, if you wanted to play him on the king side, then Rook A D1 or Rook E1 would have been the move. Instead, now after Rook F D1, it's going to be very hard for him to get at any sort of E5 or F4 idea in the future. So it doesn't look like a very big deal, but going Rook F to D1 instead of Rook A D1 does limit his options on the king side. However, his queen side play, maybe with A5 in the future, is a little more promising. Now here, Magnus A6, expanding on the queen side. Now here with A6, Magnus Carlsen is threatening the idea of B5, expanding further on the queen side. That pawn would be supported by the A6 pawn. So here, Hans Niemann, he kind of actually has to do something. All of his pieces are on excellent squares, his bishops, queen, minor pieces, his rooks, but you can't win a chess game just by sitting back and waiting, especially as white. So here, the best move for Hans is actually a temporary pawn sacrifice, E5. Now, this is the move you want to play as white in this kind of position, and here it actually works because of black's last move, A6. That move A6 leaves the pawn on B6 defended only by the queen, and you can capitalize on that. Here's how. The move is E5. You break in the center, then black takes on E5, and here black is attacking the pawn with the queen and the knight. However, if black takes advantage of that with knight takes, then queen takes, that is the best sequence for black. Then you jump in with the bishop to the B6 square. Bishop takes B6, Suddenly, you regain the pawn, but black's pawn structure on the queen side is just destroyed. Yours is not. And beyond that, that bishop on b7 is not doing a whole lot right now. And of course, c5 would be problematic for black as well. So here, Hans Niemann would have a very stable long-term advantage if he found the key move e5 in response to black's a6, which does set up that weakness on the b6 square. Now, instead, in the game, he goes bishop to f4. So this is a very solid idea. The idea behind bishop f4 is he is threatening e5 without losing a pawn. However, the drawback, if Magnus does go e5 right away, as he did in the game, then the pawn is defended. I mean, here Hans can take on e5, he did in the game, but now the bishop has to retreat back to the e3 square. So overall, this does play into Magnus Carlsen's hand here, and now we have sort of a King's Indian defense style structure. Black does have that pawn on e5. His pawns on the queen side are a little bit vulnerable, but overall, he's doing relatively okay. Now here, the best idea for black is going to be b5, immediately expanding on the queen side. The idea being you want to stop bishop c4 from white. If white can get bishop c4 in, then that bishop on c4, and potentially you can go knight g5, try to gang up on that pawn on f7, and overall that bishop will be much more active on this diagonal here than it is on e2. So b5, the best idea for black. However, Magnus doesn't see it. He goes rook to e8, a little bit of a problematic move. So first of all, you allow bishop c4, b5 isn't there to stop it, and then beyond that, that bishop is eyeing the vulnerable f7 square, and again, knight g5 ideas are now possible. So what does Magnus Carlsen do? He goes b5, this is a good move, objectively a good move. Here, Hans Niemann retreats the bishop, bishop b3. There was a stronger idea here, a takes b4 that he missed, so, blitz game, these things happen. Bishop b3 on the board. And now this is where the fireworks start in this game. I told you these were the six best games from this series. Magnus goes for on the queen side with the move b4. Now the idea behind this move is very simple. The knight doesn't really have a good square. For example, going to a2 or b1 looks ridiculous. e2 isn't all that great either because now the f5 and the h5 squares are covered by this g-pawn. And if he goes knight to e2, then g3, the knight really isn't doing that much. So here, Hans Niemann, he finds a creative solution. Knight g5. Yes, this is a knight sacrifice. Chess C2, don't even try to argue with me on this one. I know you guys love to point out that sometimes sacrifices aren't sacrifices. Well, you're wrong in this case. This is a knight sacrifice. That knight on c3 is going down. And here, what should Magnus do? Well, the best computer move is going to be rook to f8, just defending. Then the knight has to go back to, say, a2 or b1 or e2. And again, it's depressing for white. But Magnus Carlsen, he is not interested in playing the quote-unquote best moves. No, instead, he does not go rook f8. He actually just takes the knight on the c3 square. B takes c3 on the board. And now, of course, the queen is being attacked. But Hans has the intermediate move. Bishop takes f7, winning the pawn. So now the king has to go somewhere. H8's the best square. You don't want to go to f8 and then allow future knight h7 or other craziness. Instead, h8 on the board. Now, of course, the pawn on c3 is attacking the queen. Queen takes c3 is the move. And now rook e7 getting out of the attack. And finally, bishop b3 getting the bishop to safety. All right, those last few moves were sort of forced. I mean, yes, both sides had some different options they had, but everything was being attacked. You can't ignore the attack on the queen or the bishop or anything else. So what's going on here? Let's look at material first of all. Here, Magnus Carlsen has the 4 minor pieces versus the 3 of Hans Niemann. That means Magnus is up a piece. However, Hans Niemann does have 2 extra pawns, the one on the F file and the B file. So overall, Magnus is all about 1 pawn. However, beyond that, Magnus Carlsen's king on H8 is incredibly vulnerable. Knight to F7 ideas are in the air. Hans Niemann controlling the open D file. His queen's better placed. His bishops are better placed. His bishops on B7 and G7 aren't doing anything right now. So despite being down a pawn in, loose terms, Hans Niemann still has the advantage here. And now Magnus, what does he do? He goes H6, begging the knight to jump in to either F7 or E6. Now this was a big mistake. Instead, the computer likes the idea of c5 expanding on the queen side, opening up the bishop attacking on e4, and overall try to restrict white's bishop on e3. Instead, h6 on the board. Now the knight can jump into somewhere. Hans finds the best idea, knight to e6, forking both the queen on c7 and that bishop on g7. Now here, you can't allow something like knight takes g7. If you move the queen, then knight takes g7 is just devastating. Instead, here, Magnus Carlsen takes the knight on the e6 square. Rook takes e6, giving up the rook for the knight. Now bishop takes, and what's his idea? Knight to f8, knocking back the bishop, bishop b3 on the board. Then you take on e4, and then once the queen moves, you jump back to the f6 square. Now here, again, the position is very complicated. The computer seems to think the best idea for white is going to be queen to d6, centralizing the queen, trying to get the queens off the board, off queen takes, rook takes, and from here, white should have the advantage in the endgame. Now instead of this, here white makes a very big mistake in the game. a5, expanding on the queen side. The problem with this move is here Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the knight, knight d5, and suddenly queen d6 ideas are simply off the table. Now here, of course, Magnus Carlsen has those two extra minor pieces versus the extra rook and the pawns of Hans Niemann. And here Magnus is demonstrating his experience. He knows if he can find good places for those minor pieces and keep the rooks inactive, meaning if he can close off these open files for the rooks, then his minor pieces are going to dominate the board. And that is what we see here. Here Hans Niemann tries to go c4, knocking off that knight off that perfect d5 square. Hans Niemann takes the bishop on e3. Knight takes, queen takes. Now, of course, Magnus has the bishop pair in addition to his other advantages, those bishops being on b7 and g7. And here Magnus plays a series of excellent moves. c5, activating this bishop on b7 down this diagonal. And one move later, e4, activating the other bishop. Now both of his bishops are coming to life. The knight's going to come into e6. Black is looking fantastic, and white here is really struggling. Now from here, Hans Niemann retreats the bishop back to the c2 square. Hans Niemann kind of going back and forth with his pieces. He really doesn't have an active plan here. And Magnus simply defends the pawn on e4, develops the rook. His position looks better and better as the game goes along. Now Hans starts the idea of doubling rooks on the open d-file. Good idea. Magnus king h7, Hans rook a d1. And here Magnus just picks up that pawn on the a5 square. A good move. And now how does Hans Niemann justify losing the pawn? He tries to jump in with the rook to the d6 square. Rook d6 on the board. But Magnus just retreats the queen, defending absolutely everything for now. Now a relatively weak move from Hans Niemann, b3, the idea being that pawn on the b2 square was being attacked by the bishop on g7, but overall a little bit of a slow move. b3 doesn't do a whole lot to improve his position. And the big problem with this move is here, Magnus Carlsen, if he finds it, he has a very big tactical shot that can basically decide the game on the spot. This is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to solve this one. There is a beautiful tactical shot from Magnus Carlsen right here. All right, I hope you found the idea. The key move here for Magnus is bishop to e5, forking both the rook on d6 and this f4 square once the rook moves. So, for example, if you take the rook back to the d2 square, rook d2, not a bad move. Then you can give the check on h2, force the king to go to an awkward square, and then retreat back bishop f4, skewering both the queen and the rook. So this was the key idea, bishop to e5 for Magnus Carlsen. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't find it. He sees a different idea. Bishop d4, trying to cut off the communication of the rook on the d6 square. Here, Hans plays pretty much the only idea. You have to sacrifice the rook on the d4 square. Either rook 6 takes d4 or rook 1 takes d4. Now in the game, Hans takes with the rook on d1. Rook 1 takes d4, then c takes and queen takes, and now queen to e7 for Magnus Carlsen, increasing the defense of that pawn on the e4 square. So far, he has absolutely everything under control. Now Hans, c5. He's trying to push his queenside pawn up the board, ideally to promote on the c8 square. Can Magnus defend the idea? Well, here he actually makes a big mistake. He goes e3, trying to expand that pawn in the center. Now, the idea, of course, is if white takes on e3, black will recapture with the queen and force the queens off the board. That sort of happens. F takes e3, but now Magnus, instead of queen takes e3, the best idea by far, Here he goes queen to g5. Now Magnus does have an idea here, obviously threatening checkmate in one move on the g2 square, but Hans Niemann is ready. c6, blocking the bishop on this diagonal here and stopping the threat. Now the bishop has to go back to the c8 square. There's nowhere else. a8 will be a terrible square for the bishop. And now rook to f6 for Hans Niemann. Hans trying to increase the pressure on the king side. Now from here, the king gets off this diagonal with the bishop, king g8 on the board. But then Hans, bishop d3, setting up bishop c4 threats, once again trying to target that king on g8. Now here Magnus, he has had enough. He plays the queen move, queen takes e3, trying to force the queens off the board. That is what happens. Queen takes and then rook takes on e3. But here Hans is still doing all right. He gives the check on the c4 square, bishop c4, hitting the king on g8. Now instead of king h7, here the knight goes to the e6 square, stopping the check. That's a little bit of a weird move. Self-pitting the knight to the king. However, Magnus does have an idea. Here, the best move for Hans Niemann is going to be rook takes g6, winning the pawn with check. However, he doesn't find it. Instead, c7 on the board. This was a fatal mistake, and here Magnus Carlsen just plays king g7. And now look at this. If the rook moves, the knight on the e6 square is going to fall, as it's currently being defended by the bishop and the rook, whereas black attacks it twice. So what is Hans Niemann going to do? In the game, bishop takes e6 is the move, but then rook takes e6, and after rook to f3 from Hans Niemann, here Magnus, rook c6. He is up a clean bishop. That pawn on c7 is going to fall. There is literally no way to save the game. And in this position, Hans Niemann resigns to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game by Magnus in the modern defense, but don't go anywhere. This next game is even crazier.